This is the preview of the new podcast in the series How to Create a Glitch in the Matrix, The 4 Principles, Season 1, Chapter 1. In order to understand this podcast, it will be necessary to listen to the episode of How to Create a Glitch in the Matrix, The 4 Principles, immediately prior. That episode discusses the nature of the 4 principles and application of those principles, exploring their foundation, articulation, and application to the system as a whole. This episode will build on that episode of the monologues, and the podcast series The Digital Key and Tree of Life. The first distinction that must be made is between inward-facing application of the 4 principles and outward-facing application of the 4 principles. Outward-facing application involves articulating how these principles describe physical processes at each spatial scale of the interaction. So, for example, there are the scales which we traditionally understand to be those within the spatial world, such as the biological, the chemical, the atomic, the subatomic. Each scale of the physical world is understood to be governed by physical forces such as electromagnetism, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, and gravity. Inward-facing application involves looking at physical processes of these forces as reflections of consciousness, or the structures of the digital key. So, in other words, we can look at how our manipulation of physical processes through technology reflects the 4 principles in application at each scale. But we may also see that these changes that technology permits reflect adjustments within the field of consciousness manifesting as the structures of the digital key. This is what is meant by inward-facing. In other words, in this process, we begin outward-facing, in analyzing a technological process according to the 4 principles, and then we work backward from those principles to see how that technology alters the structures of the digital key which describe consciousness. But it is also true that the 4 principles are represented by each of the physical forces attributed to nature. And they are also represented at each spatial scale of interaction, with the caveat that each scale has nested within it the lower such that each spatial scale is nested in the one above. This is the outward-facing application of the 4 principles. But the inward-facing application of the 4 principles shows us that the nesting which also occurs within consciousness is a nesting within folds in time, or paths nested through nonlinearity in postural releases or expressions that release tension. This follows from the recognition that nonlinear intersections, which release tension, arise from nested paths within these folds in time, within the realm of consciousness, and the structures of the digital key. In effect, both outward-facing application of the 4 principles reveals that at each scale are the 4 principles, rather like a fractal. While the structures of consciousness demonstrate that fractal pattern to be of the same form. That is, the players at each scale of an interaction remain the same individuals involved at the others. So scale in the inward-facing application does not change who is inducing nonlinear intersections. They remain of the same class of subjects described in the structures at each level. That is, the fractal pattern reveals the same world, the same players at each scale of consciousness. Whereas the outward-facing application of the 4 principles reveals that each scale has different players and processes, although follows the same principles, though they are all connected by the nesting of the fractal pattern. It is also important to note here that we are not suggesting that the 4 principles describe each scale of the spatial world independently of consciousness. Rather, we are asserting that technology maps changes in each scale onto consciousness represented by structural changes within the structures of the digital key. In other words, we are saying that the processes of the 4 fundamental forces are interpreted through the lens of the 4 principles at each scale of an interaction, which reflect shifts within consciousness represented by the structures described in these podcasts. It is also important to note that the scales relevant to each technology aren't closed. They aren't merely restricted to the spatial scales of reductionism. Rather, they may be represented by distinct forms of information. For example, digital technology, which relies on packets of data, may likewise reflect the 4 principles at scale. Let me give you an example. A cell phone is used to communicate between people. which makes it much more closely tied to human consciousness than, say, a nuclear reactor. But we can observe that cell phones and Wi-Fi technology impact the formation of relationships, the bonds between people, how they communicate, when and how they meet. Cell phones are an intermediary, which directly shapes how human beings interact spatially and relationally. It is thus a perfect example to apply an inward-facing application of the four principles, because it channels actual structural changes within consciousness through the technology. Cell phones require a power source, a battery, which relies upon electrochemical processes to produce a charge. This charge is understood through the physics of electromagnetism. This charge is a product of positive and negative ions within the battery. We can understand that this charge is a reflection of the principle of polarity, reliant upon conservation of charge, energy and momentum. A cell phone prior to use involves two individuals with distinct experiences of reality, locations, which may be spatially distinct. When two people call each other or communicate through text messages, they are bringing their subjectivity into proximity. That proximity is mediated by a third structure member, who joins the structure together. That is, whereas we might see two digital streams describing two spatially segregated actors, we then see one joined experience represented by a single digital stream through a third common individual. For example, polarity within the structures of the digital key is represented by actors in the same structure with dialectical impulses. So, for example, person A affirms impulse 1 for person B and negates impulse not 1. Person A affirms impulse not 1 for person C and negates impulse 1. This is a reflection of preferential expectation matching. That is, A prefers meeting the expectations of B for affirmation of impulse 1 and prefers negating impulse 1 for person C. The next principle which applies is union, facilitated by the cell phone joining their digital streams into a single structure, which is to say that preferential expectation matching creates a hierarchical relationship between persons B and C, such that priority is established by the structure. Next, we have conservation, which is to say that affirmation of set 1 corresponding to impulse 1 for person B, and affirmation of set not 1 for person C, balance out to a complete set. Just as negation of set 1 and negation of set not 1 balance out to negate the full set. Nothing is added and nothing is lost. Finally, we have substitution and displacement, which is the fourth principle. Here we see that even if persons B and C maintain the same impulse in affirmation independently of person A, the hierarchical joining of the two streams under person A displaces that affirmation through a phase flip. The conclusion we can draw from this is that the cell phone in this example implements hierarchical priority by connecting individual subject to the affirmation and negation of some common third person in the joining of digital streams by that third person. Cell phones facilitate consolidation of priority amongst unconnected individuals who are spatially segregated. They do this because of the principle of polarity in the technology. In effect, polarity within technology has a grounding effect, preserving and consolidating existing hierarchical priority by joining structures into a single stream and imposing phase flips according to preferential expectation matching, which precedes and induces the connection. That's the end of the podcast for today.